Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we gotta talk about the new album from Rick Ross, titled Hood Billionaire. You know, it's rare that artists choose to release two unique records in the same year. It's even more rare that both the albums turn out to be good, because if they aren't both incredibly solid, or even just merely good or don't display unique ideas, maybe you might have half an album apiece of good songs with the rest being kind of duds, you'll get naysayers, like myself, who will say, well, why didn't you just release one excellent album material instead of just two okay ones? Wouldn't that be better for your career overall? And that's if the albums actually turn out to be good. Instead, for our case today, we've got Rick Ross, who can be reasonably described as having peaked in 2010 with Teflon Don and has struggled to maintain relevance, presence, and put out a half-decent album ever since. And ever since I reviewed Mastermind back in February of this year, I've continued to struggle with what this guy's appeal is. The closest thing being that, well, he picks solid enough beats with a veneer of class to rap over, a wallow in decadence and mafioso imagery that's paper thin, and an obvious over-the-top fantasy. But go beyond that, what do you get here? He's not a technically skilled rapper, he doesn't tell interesting stories with grime or texture, he doesn't have the same sense of humor as like a T.I. or a Ludacris, or the creativity of a Big Crit or a Jay-Z, and outside of a deep voice, he just doesn't come across all that convincing in that gangster role in comparison to artists like Jeezy or Freddie Gibbs or Pusha T. Mostly because Rick Ross goes so over the top with it that it becomes hard to believe and buy into. And you know what, let's be completely honest here. Outside of Mastermind going to number 1 on the Billboard 200, this really hasn't been a great year for Rick Ross, at least in terms of the charts. His biggest song in 2014 will likely be the verse he dropped in that only kinda decent Chris Brown-Usher collaboration, New Flame. And outside of that, what more need do we have for another Rick Ross album this year? You might say that's how bosses do it, but if anything, it screams a desperation, a desperate desire to remain in the spotlight. But you know what? I figured I might as well give Rick Ross one last chance to really impress me. So if we get anything new here with Hood Billionaire? Look folks, it's a Rick Ross album. What the hell do you think comes up on this album? I have to be honest though, Hood Billionaire by Rick Ross was a chore to get through, because at least Mastermind had some ambition behind it, conceptually, where Rick Ross tried to inject some religion and philosophy into his material to add some context to why he does what he does. On Hood Billionaire, we don't even get that. Just track after track of brand label porn, cocaine, and wasted opportunities. And you know what? It's not even that this album is outright offensive garbage either. It's just on the boring side of mediocre, just a couple shades lower than Mastermind. So you know, okay, what's different about this album? What could possibly make it special in Rick Ross's discography? Well, outside of a couple samples from real drug dealers and kingpins behind bars right now promising to work for Rick Ross or at least boost his street cred, not a lot. There are fragments of the story. The introduction has Rick Ross and one of his posse digging up 4 bags of drugs worth $8 million a bag. Phone tap is about a childhood friend betraying him to the cops. Keep Doing That, Rich Bitch has he and R. Kelly talking about screwing wealthy women. But at the end of the day, most of this album is Rick Ross going on and on about selling cocaine. And you know what? It's very telling that when you get rappers like Killer Mike viciously criticizing the Reagan years for the horrible damage that crack cocaine did to black communities in the 1980s, instead from Rick Ross you get songs like Coke Like the 80s, which actively glorifies that era. It shows such a disconnect between Rick Ross's attempt at gangsta rap and the reality of it all that it stretches his persona to the absolute breaking point. On Heavyweight, he brags about buying a house across the street from Miss Trap despite all of his money, and yet it doesn't realize that given his wealth, it makes him a massive target, even despite his supposed criminal network that would protect him. Or take Burn, where he ends his chorus with direct threats against George Zimmerman. And I'll reiterate what I said last time when I reviewed Mastermind. There's a marked difference between Trayvon Martin and Rick Ross. The latter who spends most of this album shouting about dealing cocaine or killing people with automatic weapons. Or take Family Ties, where Rick Ross tries to get introspective about his loneliness at the top and how black history and culture is being neglected in favor of brand names. You know, you might be contributing to that a little bit, Rick Ross, and you could play a major part in changing it. If you're so powerful and influential as a rapper as it is, and yet you keep selling the same old shit. Hell, most of that same song features a chorus to just literally look at me. Look at me. Or take the song Brimstone, where Rick Ross tries to talk about faith and then just gets into this long, meandering, sampled outro, trying to justify all his activity as he's a product of his environment. And those who don't like his activity nowadays just don't like success. No, Rick Ross, I don't like your material because of all your pseudo-Randian glorification of success. You're still glorifying a lifestyle that perpetuates shallow materialism, selling drugs, and killing all those who get in your way. You are embodying the bad stereotype here. What's all the more frustrating frustrating is that the feeling of waste that comes up all over this album. Now, forget the obvious indicators. More money than he knows what to deal with, so he spends it on gaudy jewelry and cars and houses and weapons instead of giving back to the community. But the way Rick Ross treats his guest stars is particularly wasteful. Jay-Z delivered one of the few redeeming verses on Masterminds, The Devil's a Lie, but in his collaboration on Movin' Bass, Rick Ross only puts him on the chorus. Are you kidding? This is Jay-Z. What are you doing not giving him a verse? Happens again with Big Crit on Brimstone. You have one of the most promising MCs out of the South who could really use that real mainstream breakthrough push right now, and you only throw him on a hook, and yet you chose to give a full guest verse to R. Kelly, who, despite having a bit of real flavor and charisma on his verse that was kind of welcome, he's not a rapper. And while Snoop Dogg does sound a little bit more invested than normal and quintessential, his brand of pimp rap isn't anything all that special and that we haven't seen the past 20 years. And look, as for the rest of the guest stars, I found myself really unimpressed by Whole Slab, Project Pat, and Boozy Badass, especially from a technical rhyming standpoint. And while Yo Gotti's probably the best of the bunch with a little bit more lyrical flavor, I gotta admit I'm still underwhelmed here. And even all the more surprising is that for as much as Rick Ross calls out his label, Maybach Music Group, there's nothing from Stali, Meek Mill, or Wale. Granted, no French Montana either, only a good thing. But as much as Rick Ross is pushing his label, you'd think he would collaborate with them more, give them that mainstream push to get some airplay coming off of his album, which will likely do well, likely be the best chance any of them have at getting that spotlight. So okay, what about the beats? Well, what about them? If you're familiar with Rick Ross, you already know what you're getting here. And yet I can't help but feel that he's starting to repeat himself and fall into bad habits, with the title track trying to replicate that dark swell and horns that worked for Rick Ross in the past, and Nickel Rock sounding like a synth tone over a trap beat that sounds about 4 years out of date. And that's not saying that there aren't some beats that aren't bad on this album. I like the ominous piano melody of Coke Like the 80s, the drowned out loneliness of Phone Tap, the swirling rush of Movin' Bass, and the horns backing up K. Michelle on If They Knew, both courtesy of Timbaland, which I liked, and the old school vibe of Family Ties, which was nice. Hell, Big Crit's production on Brimstone was decent, even though I do think the guitar tone felt a little bit runny and slurred at points. But overall, many of these beats just feel like standard trap bangers from Rick Ross that I've heard before, but very little in terms of interesting melody or instrumentation that made them feel unique or interesting. And you know what? I could probably say the exact same thing about Rick Ross's rapping, because it's not like the problems that I've had with this guy for years have gone away. He still rhymes words with themselves way too often. He recycles flows, phrases, and brand labels tirelessly. He forces rhymes if not altogether ignoring them, and his flow is still nothing all that special. And coming from Shady 15 to this was a hard come down, I gotta say. If anything, his choruses are actively getting worse, often boiled down to a single phrase or a few words that he just repeat over and over until your brain hemorrhages. And maybe it's an issue with tempo or pace, because so little of this has real energy beyond Rick Ross is getting louder, and the punch is so broad that it does nothing for me. There's nothing cutting about this album. And now, some of you are probably saying, Mark, come on, you used to like crunk music, and if anything, that's less lyrical than this. And you know what? That's right. But Lil Jon was at least populist, and you at least tell that he was having fun. With Rick Ross, so much of this is artless bragging played so seriously with no sense of humor, and so much of it is filled with different euphemisms and slang for the exact same things. In this case, cocaine, that just doesn't feel that much fun. There's no party vibe on here. I can't groove to this. So yeah, Hood Billionaire is not getting a recommendation. Unless I hear that Rick Ross is planning a major shift in his formula, I think I'm just about done covering Rick Ross records. I've never bought into his overblown, phony persona anyways, with every attempt at drama falling completely flat because Rick Ross is never willing to let himself show the slightest real chance of vulnerability. So for me, it's another 4 out of 10 and no recommendation. Unless you're a hardcore Rick Ross fan and for some reason are content with him giving you just more of the same with even less ideas. At this point, it's less luxury rap than luxury masturbation. And right now, I'm getting sick of hearing it. Skip this album. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine why this review will have some controversy, but overall, what did you guys think? Did you guys think it was worthwhile? Did you think it did enough different? Even if it was doing more of the same, did you like it? I certainly didn't. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's anything else coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.